Hey guys, welcome back to the Lit Mag Lab podcast. I'm Jazz Marie, aka Vevna Forrow. So previously on the podcast, I was taking the time to show you around Seaside Gothic, yeah, which is a literary arts magazine based in the United Kingdom that has a really cool site design and really lovely incorporation of photography in their issues. And I also share their Patreon setup and discuss their guidelines. And yeah, so totally listen back to that Spotlight Under the Slide episode. I've done a couple of those the past few days and a bunch others, and probably will do a few more before the end of the year in terms of sharing different lit mag journals and presses, and occasionally from time to time covering questions. So there is a question I have today that I want to do, and discuss, so there's a Q&A section I created on some parts where the series goes out to, so you can listen to that part of the series versus the spotlight episodes. Again, you can see my screen, what I'm discussing out on YouTube, the Spotify app, and elsewhere. So yeah, so here we go. I think it's important to discuss the history of rhyme. I may have mentioned rhyme on this podcast before or covered this a little bit, but I want to do this in a separate episode entirely and also share a little bit about my experience with rhyming, because I do have a history with rhyme. I myself do have a history of rhyme. Aside from the history of rhyme, which I'll take the time to share with you guys, I'm on poets.org right now. They have a wonderful glossary section. If you've never, checked out poets.org, totally, it's a great site to bookmark, sign up for, the Academy of American Poets newsletter. And yeah, they even have, a membership that you can get, right? And it's pretty awesome. So I'm quoting this off of the page. I'll link in the description any links or pages I cover so you can access them again. And yeah, so let's get going here. Rhyme is the correspondence of sounds in words or lines of verse. And it states here rhyme is often considered a defining feature of poetry, but it is a relatively new technique. Ancient Greek and Roman poetry did not rhyme, and early European poetry did not rhyme either. In the West, rhyme began to emerge during the medieval period. In other countries, such as China, rhyming occurred much earlier. In fact, the earliest surviving evidence of rhyming dates back to China in the 10th century BC. There are many different types of rhymes characterized by the syllables of the words and the placement of the words in a line or stanza. Perfect rhyme, the typical example of rhyme, occurs if the words final stress vowel and all following sounds are identical. For example, bright and flight are perfect rhymes. Poetry usually uses end rhyme, the rhyming of the final syllables of a pair or group of lines. When two words in the same line rhyme, it's called internal rhyme. Poets might also use slant rhyme, which describes words that sound similar but don't exactly rhyme, such as young and long. And then below that, there are some examples that they provide of rhymes from various poets in over the course of history. And yeah, I was taking a look at the Rita Dove poem Testimony 1968, and the other ones I have read before. But yeah, a bunch of poets and writers throughout time, a colossal amount of them have rhymed at least some point in their life. And I think that's very interesting. I'm sure you know The Raven, right? Edgar Allan Poe. There's Robert Frost, T.S. Eliot, tons of poets, right, out there. Till today, writers rhyme, and yeah, so I think, in the whole aspect of the question, though, I will say, I mentioned this earlier in the podcast in the series, though, quite frankly, I don't see a lot of lit mag journals and presses heavily publishing rhyme poetry. And I think that's, interesting, right? So I will share some personal things here, in my experience with rhyme, by the way. So when I had experienced some rather physical traumatic events back to back in 2020, and that window of 2020 and 2021, I had gotten into, you could say, a rhyming phase. I was easing back into poetry after a very, very long break from, you could say, really focusing on creative writing. More so, I would say throughout my life, I was more so of an artist. I didn't do nothing but writing throughout my life. I did a lot of cartooning, a lot of drawing, up till 2019. And I started again, writing poetry way back in sixth grade. When we had projects tied to that, my grandpa sent me some, books that poets had published, right, of different ages. And then in high school, and there were some, aside from middle school, right, there were projects tied to poetry again. So I, really enjoyed those assignments, creating different styles of poetry. And I ended up, self publishing some collections because of those, assignments in school and sharing those high school poems, and dumping them into, you could say, pretty rando collections, like Extinct, right? That collection, which I guess I also threw into Chirp on Wood, another self published collection. And yeah, so, in the end of towards the end of 2021, or winter, I ended up uh really diving back into more so, I would say, submitting quite a bit to lit mags and journals. And I did nothing but predominantly rhyme, off to them. And, it resulted in, you could say, a ton of rejections, right? I've had, several hundred rejections myself. And, the first ever poem acceptance I had with the literary journal was through the Lothlorien Poetry Journal, which I covered in episode 45 of this podcast. If you want to learn more about Lothlorien, listen to that episode. But they had accepted two poems that were rhyme focused, right? And I had come across Lothlorien Poetry Journal, if I recall, in a blog article, if I remember, or through a search. I can't remember exactly, but I think it was through an article. There was a list of places, because I was searching for places like, I wonder what places accept rhyme poetry, right? So I, saw a list of them. And Better Than Starbucks was one, I think, on that list of, places that, had been, more receptive to poetry that rhymes. And I think I did submit to them in the past, so yeah. They are still on hiatus. They have been for quite some time. I don't know if they've completely closed or shut down. I hope they do return. Their site is still up though, and everything. So yeah, I some lit magazine journals pause for several years and come back or take a break. So I don't know. Better Than Starbucks. They have a really awesome name, by the way. I don't know if they're ever going to come back or not. And yeah, anyways, Better Than Starbucks, I think, was on that list. Lothlorien, journal was as well. So, and I tried submitting to a couple places back then, right? That had been on that list, more receptive to rhymesters, right? Poetry that rhymes. And yeah, so I did end up, getting two poems placed with Lothlorien, Poetry Journal. Those poems that I had, those two at Creator Talk and Recaptures, right? So one tied more so was inspired by, you could say, grief and loss. And the second one was more so thinking about, who do we call when bad things keep happening to us, right? And I was thinking a little about, who you're going to call Ghostbusters, right? That saying, right? But in reality, I think a lot of us, for us in terms of, people, our go-to people for who we call, it's oftentimes a loved one, a family member. For me, it was always, my parents, right? So I had mom call at the end of that poem, right? And a lot of end rhymes, right? And yeah, and of course I thought about putting dad call there too, but I put mom call. And we have people are go-to people in life, or a support network, or people when something bad happens to us, or series of unfortunate events. That's what that poem was sort of relaying. And yeah, so for some it could be, your parents, a partner, a bestie in life, or I think we all have someone that we think about, someone to call when things, you could say, shit hits the fan. Sorry, pardon my language, but yeah. Yeah, so that was again my first ever acceptance of a literary journal, December 2021, in Lothlorien, poetry journal. I won't read those, poems on this podcast, but, you know, I have, I think I shared a bit in that episode 45, maybe talked about the poems again there. In anthology I participated in, also in that year through All Poetry, that community, the Words with Wings anthology with Kevin Watt. Yeah. So that poem I had in the Words with Wings anthology, it had a rhyme poem, and it tied back to a lot of, the physical trauma I was going through at the time. And yeah, so, in terms of, rhyme, right, and then the majority of the poems I've had, placed in lit mags and journals and published, are not at all in rhyme, at all, actually. So yeah, I'm not, I would say, a rhymester, actually. Again, I think what had prompted me to start the Jazzy Hummingbird project, which is this, as you can see on my screen. It is a series, essentially, of, it states 52 books, but they're very short. They're bite sized, most of them. Mini collections that are all themed and are nearly all in rhyme, across the board. And I started this series again because I was in a lot of shock and physical trauma and pain. One of the most painful experiences I ever had in my life happened in 2020, and back to back events. So I was going through a lot of physical trauma, physical shock, intracranial pressure, and you know, a lot of my personal work, not the Jazzy Hummingbird project, but personal work outside of, selected work in lit mag journals and presses. And this, goes more so into tying back to healthcare and, are a bit medical in nature and venting. I think some of my collections I totally vented a little bit, and yeah. But my work, just the backstory of some of my work outside of, selections of lit mag journals and presses and elsewhere, right? So um the the whole aspect of, I think a lot of young people or people of all ages, they still have their emergencies dismissed, or, are told, oh, it's just anxiety, oh, it's just panic attacks, or you're hypochondriac or a googler, right? And that happened to me, actually, quite a bit, when I was going through a lot of really painful, weird, bizarre things physically. And it led up to a lot of, mistakes and wrong calls. My folks had, never seen some of the things that had happened to me physically, and it again, led to a lot of, wrong calls again and errors, right? And the things that had happened to me occurred around the time of the pandemic too, which is even worse, right? Because it's a very stressful time, right? And it's very hard to get emergency help. So I had multiple times where you could say I was dismissed or told, oh, you're exaggerating, oh, you're too young to have any problems, or, oh, everything's normal, or it's just a headache. And, so in reality, it was very, what I was going through. I won't get into specific details or overly graphic on this podcast, but in reality, I was going through, again, truly the most pain I've ever experienced in my entire life. And had others just, taken a couple more minutes with me, it would have made all the difference, right? A lot of, things that I'm going through now could have been, prevented, or, could have been, never had to happen, had I been taken seriously, right? Sometimes people state something, happened to them, or something that they had, occur to them physically, and people are like, oh, that's impossible. There's no way that could have happened, without, even doing a deep dive scan of you, and dismissing you, or, thinking it's all in your head, or, saying, people had said, both in my fam and, medical professionals, both in and outside the emergency setting, right, had said some rather disturbing, rather disgusting things to me. And I had gone through several years of name calling and very, disrespectful, rude behavior. And it was just rather heartbreaking. And, I think, it's very dangerous for people to state, you're exaggerating, or, it's, you're too young to have this, and that, right? When it, without checking you thoroughly and pushing meds on you in a confused state of shock, and a mindset. And sorry, I'm sort of diving to a separate, topic here, but just sharing the backstory of some of my personal work and what led up to me, diving into a lot of rhymes, so, I think it's rather dangerous to do that, if someone's in a state of shock, physical trauma, and if you state, and, no one's done a deep dive scan of you, if you, introduce any, prescribe any medications to someone, of any age, right? It can lead to further permanent damage. It can do a lot of harm to them. And yeah, so a lot of wrong calls were made, and it led up to, my whole left side screwed up now, my left hand, all of that, right? And there's nothing fake or pretend, at all, it's rather painful, some of the things people said to me way back, and even, in recent years, right? Oh, you're a bullshitter, or it's all made up and stuff. There's nothing, at all, tied to that. I think it's so painful when people say that, to you when you're going through a very hard time, and then they're like, oh, now things are showing up, in later years, right? And had people just looked very carefully, right, a bit closer, right? A lot of young women, men, human beings of all ages could have had, you know, uh, damage prevented to their body. Sometimes it's permanent damage, sometimes it's irreversible, and, that didn't have to happen. Again, if people just take the time to, really look at you a few more minutes, or to really listen to what you're saying. Because some emergencies, have to be treated in a matter of, minutes, every second counts, and it was just baffling, how many times I was, not taken seriously, or just poked, and one scan here, another scan here, it's pretty haphazard, the care I had received, even after, some appointments, and after the fact of the pandemic, right? It was just really bizarre, the things people were saying, and it really affected me. It was very traumatic, right? If you ever have, a legit emergency and people dismiss you, right, it's going to obviously, lead to, the longer it's not attended to, right, it gets worse and worse and worse. So it was very painful for me, and I was in a lot of shock and trauma. So what people normally do when something bad happens to them, they go to things that offer them comfort, right? And for me, that was always writing and art. And obviously, right, cartooning was a huge part of my life, and what I enjoyed. So at most I could do, right, was digital collage art, and writing poetry. So I started the Jazzy Hummingbird project. It led to, 52 mini collections. They're not all poetry focused, but predominantly it is all rhyme, and I'm not saying, the Jazzy Hummingbird project, and it's, I call it that because, my folks, throughout my life had, called me Jazzy, right? And that's tied to my actual name, right? My nickname a little bit, right? Jazz. And then the hummingbirds, right? I would see a lot of hummingbirds here in Nevada, when I was going through rather traumatic, painful events. And yeah, so that led to that. And, 2020, 2021, I joined a lot of different, poetry apps, communities, and yeah, I started, diving back into, the Instagram poetry community. I started the Hummingbird Blink podcast in February of 2022, and it took my mind off of a lot of the intense physical, trauma I was going through, and the damage. And yeah, it's not a joke at all. So a lot of my personal work ties into that. The Jazzy Hummingbird project is, I think, separate from all of that, the other works I've done. Yeah, it covers, the importance of friendships, separations, breakups, betrayal, cheating, liars, and it covers pigeons even, and so it's humorous in nature. I'd say a lot of it, but not all. And yeah, so I have other collections that are more focused on things I went through and experienced in terms of physical trauma. And yeah, and the importance of not taking things lightly, and to really carefully listen to anyone of any age regarding what they're stating, right? um Again, yeah, I was in a whole rhyme phase for majority of 2021. As you can see here, right, if we scroll through, you can see it's mostly all from 2021, this series that's predominantly all rhyme. If you want to totally check it out, some poets absolutely did enjoy some of these collections. I think probably my favorite one out of all of them is Galactic Bird Brain. I put some of these collections in print, but a lot of them are no longer available in print because they were pulled out of distribution. And yeah, so also pulling a lot of these out of the Kindle Unlimited plan, not because it's not good, but of course it limits your distribution reach, right? And most recently, I think they changed it where you can actually distribute to libraries if it's in KDB Select, but only there, not outside of libraries. Additionally, like through D2D and other places. So that's something new. I think I mentioned on the Brie podcast episode, right? Brie helps with, publishers and, small and magazine issues get distributed in front of, more libraries and schools. But there, if you can't get, as a writer outside of that, right? In general, right? If you're a self publisher, right? And in KDV Select, now they do permit you to, go through like D2D through their library option only. Otherwise, you have to pull it out of that, KDP Select. And once the window is expired, then you can distribute elsewhere, right? So there's exclusivity with Kindle Unlimited, things you have to read very carefully. Otherwise, you'll breach the agreement with them. But yeah, a lot of these poems I put into print collections, and back then others had ordered. And yeah, but this series was a lot of fun to put together. A lot of them are, you could say, some of it's cheesy, some of it's not. I do cover some, absolutely some things that matter to me. Love, loss, the importance of reflection, and it's not all about me. I do a lot of perspective, right? Things tied to, again, relationships, memory loss or foggy memory. And I do some collections titled in other languages for fun as well. I even have a collection of rejected rhymes, and rejections from lit magazine journals that I tossed in a collection, totally. So yeah, if you're interested, I don't like linking my work in episodes and stuff like that, but if you're interested, totally check out, under my pen name, Vevna Forrow, some of my rhymes. And even in Dippy Literary Magazine, the legacy issues of Dippy Lit Mag, right? I included, right, some fun stuff for me towards the end. Usually riddles, riddles and rhymes there. And some other issues, I included some rhymes of mine. But, all in all, I wouldn't say I'm a rhymester anymore. Again, a lot of the work I had, accepted, even in recent years, right? This year especially, I've had a lot of humorous work actually published, and not rhyming at all. So yeah, there are very few lit magazine journals out there that, again, outright state they love rhyme poetry. And some editors, founding editors, will, sometimes tell you, and if you read carefully on the site, what they're looking for, or specifically don't want to see. I've seen some things in guidelines even say, we don't want to see light verse or rhyme poetry. They outright say that. Or if you look carefully at, staff masthead bios, sometimes they'll say that what they like and don't like, in terms of poetry. I've seen that too. And maybe I'll share in the next episode an example of that or something, too. And yeah, so I think, there I couldn't find that list I found several years back on places that are more susceptible to um more open to rhyme poetry than others, rhyming poetry. But there is this list, authors published. I've mentioned them, right? They have a social media feed. They do a lot of things in terms of, helping writers find places that have open calls and things like that, right? I think they have workshops, lectures, and lists that they do and social media. It's another good way, authorspublish.com and their social media account, to find more calls for, windows for submission opportunities, right? So on my screen here, I have a article titled "8 Literary Journals That Publish Poetry That Rhymes," and yeah, by Emily Hartstone. So I'm just going to quote this off of Authors Published for you guys. So Emily states here, they often receive emails from subscribers seeking journals that are open to rhyming poetry. Some of these emails are sent by poets that write traditional forms like sonnets, and some of these emails are sent by writers that simply enjoy rhyming outside of traditional forms. The vast majority of literary journals don't have any rules prohibiting the submission of formal poetry or poems that rhyme, but they don't publish very much of either, particularly poems that rhyme. And yeah, Emily states here, they've actually had many great experiences placing formal poems without a rhyme scheme. Journals that publish a lot of rhyming work are very much in the minority. And Emily's put together a list here. So yeah, I totally agree with that. I don't see a lot of lit magazine journals that heavily publish, again, rhyming work, but there is a list here that I'll read off for you guys. I think Spark and Stone, that site is showing one of those messages that the site's not available right now. And I believe scrolling through here, Pearl Poetry and Prose, I think their site says that they are no longer. Let me see if I can find it here. Uh, Pearl is no longer accepting submissions, and I don't know if they're ever going to reopen or if they closed. I don't know the status of Pearl Poetry and Prose. But the ones on the list include Innisfree Poetry Journal. And again, I don't know the status of a lot of these, but I'm just making you aware of them. Their sites appear to be, active, some of these, right? Blue Unicorn. And yeah, so Blue Unicorn here, right, they have notes here, right, of what they like. Just an example, right? BU, Blue Unicorn, is known for welcoming formal verse, and this welcome continues, right? They're impressed by poems that read as though the poet had simply thought in the form without forced rhymes, weak words inserted to satisfy the meter, and the like. Every formal writer knows how much effort goes into seeming effortless. They look for no lesser effort in non formal verse, and they're alert for the original metaphorical image that may take a moment to prove itself just right. The unexpected word that says more than the familiar one, the sharply observed detail that brings a thing alive. They do not tolerate cliches, right? They tolerate a bit of mystery. And yeah, so yeah, it states, right, they don't want to see forced rhymes. And I think that's a comment, I see a lot from my reading team. We see some poets where it feels like they forced a rhyme, just for the sake of rhyming. And, I think a lot of people, in 1 second, I'll go back to my point here, but, the other ones in that list, Pulse Beat Poetry Journal, right? And, they feature poems of a strong musical element, a definite rhythm, right? And the Lyric magazine, right? And then Sublunary Review, right? So yeah, Westward Quarterly, right? So these are ones on the list. Again, not all of these are, open perhaps at the moment, right, to submissions. So just keep that in mind. Some of them may, in the next following year may be open again. But yeah, so I think it's interesting, some of these literary magazines, right, that seem to be more open to seeing rhymes than others. So yeah, those are some of the ones on the list. I'm aware of a few other ones outside of this, right? Lothlorien, Poetry Journal, and Better Than Starbucks. It looks like they're on hiatus still. I don't know if they're ever coming back. And there were a few other ones on that list I found from several years ago, another list entirely. So what I may do is do some more digging for you guys and put together some lists of my own on certain, themes types of forms of poetry, right, that lit magazine journals are looking for. And yeah, Emily Hartstone, right, the author of this list, has she has authored a lot of books. So yeah, this article and authors published here. This is from August 29th, 2024. So it's, a little over a year old, but some of these places still are around. So yeah, I think, lyric poetry is beautiful, and there I think I must say, I think the reason, people perhaps don't like rhyme poetry is the sense that it can feel kind of, again, generic or something they've seen before oftentimes, right? And it can feel forced, or sometimes, a little bit, I think when someone reads a rhyme, over and over again, it can sometimes, I think I've seen comments from others saying, oh, this is, I'm not talking about my reading team or anything like that. I'm talking about, like, in general online, comments from others, like, oh, it's annoying, rhyming poetry annoys them, and they're not a fan of it, or I think a lot of us, growing up, me particularly, right, we're exposed to, right, nursery rhymes, right? The gingerbread man, Humpty Dumpty, the Itsy Bitsy Spider, all of those, right? And I think the reason why those are very memorable to us, maybe, we hear it later in life or anything like that, but they're memorable to us because of the rhymes within them, right? And you can sing along to them, and it sticks in your mind, things that rhyme. It's easier to remember, I think, too, right? And yeah, but don't get in that mindset at all that poems have to rhyme. I think some writers rhyme or tend to do that because they want to make it seem like their lines are as smooth as peanut butter, in terms of flow, but that doesn't necessarily make the poem stronger, right? And poems, again, do not have to rhyme. Say that over and over to yourself again. I think what got me out of the whole rhyme phase I was in, I think is once my pain maybe settled down, and things like that. And, you can't really focus clearly when you're in a lot of excruciating, like, I was in, like crippling pain, the type that brings you to your knees or you collapse on the floor, that type. So I think that's once it settled down, and I started, Dippity Lit Mag, right, in September of 2022 and things like that. Right. Eventually, right, I, got, my first non-rhyme acceptance, right, which was, yeah, I think I also had in Phantom Kangaroo 2023, right? So, I didn't really submit to a lot of places, as much when I started Dipty, I would say, right? Because I was focused on that. I had a poem placed in Kindergarten Mag. They're defunct now, but they were really awesome too. It was formed by a group of friends, and they were based out of Nevada, actually founded out of Nevada, which was cool. But they had published a Picnic Basket Spill, and it was a romance. You could say it was one of my romance poems, and yeah, but a romantic poem, I guess you can sense, a love poem. And it was cool. They let me place one of my older cartoon drawings with it, on their site, but they're no longer up anymore, which is sad to hear. But yeah, I think, a majority of these other poems I've had published, aside from Lothlorien, the Words with Things anthology and Karen Mag, right? All the rest of them, and even my most recent ones, are not rhymes at all. And these poems are all, again, a majority of them, nearly all of them, are inspired by personal experiences that actually happened, things in my life, others in my family, right? I've done poems tied to my dad, my grandparents, even. And I think the only poem that perhaps indicates pain would be, aside from, the Grief and Loss of Lothlorien Poetry Journal, would be the Phantom Kangaroo poem, which was my first print and online acceptance. And I reshared that. I don't think they're active anymore. I don't know if they're coming back. I know Chill Subs marked them as defunct, but I never really heard what happened with Phantom Kangaroo. But I think they were really have beautiful. They had beautiful, series. And yeah, but that poem really highlighted, again, overcoming, pain, or having, maybe someone in your life that helps you get through a very painful time in your life. Maybe they, gift you music, or they gift you, support, no matter where they may be located in the world, long distance and stuff like that. So that poem sort of ties back to that. And yeah, so a lot of these poems I've had, again, I mentioned on the podcast, I think really leverage your personal experiences if you're looking to get, acceptances with lit mags and journals. You can really create some really stellar writes around things you've actually experienced and gone through, or inspired by your loved ones. Now, whether you should share those poems inspired by others in your life, things like that, maybe that's a whole separate question for another episode. you know. I think, in terms of, I've done a lot of humor, I would say I'm a rather humorous writer overall. I have, 50% of my work that's humorous, and maybe 50% of my work, and even, self-published work even, that's, on the darker side, right? Things tied to life. And then, the lighter side, like humorous writing that makes others laugh, right? And think, or smile, right? That's very playful. And I personally would say, I think in terms of rhyme, there may be certainly some lit mags and journals out there, more geared towards, a younger audience, maybe kids magazines, literary journals, kids focused ones, subject matter that for a much younger audience, children even, right? Arts around that, writing, and I think is Cricket one magazine that's for younger audience? I can't remember. I haven't read a lot of literary arts journals, tied to younger audiences, much younger, um, yeah. But I think there must be one at least out there somewhere in the world that maybe has published rhyme, poetry. And I think maybe even humor, lit magazine journals may be more open to, rhyme poetry. Not necessarily, right? I've submitted some rhymes to some humor lit magazine journals in the past, and they declined it. But this year, particularly, I sent things that didn't rhyme to, some humor lit magazine journals, right? Little Old Lady Comedy, right? Accepted 3 poems. I had a very humorous poem I mentioned during the past episode, Boats Against the Current mag. And then even the upcoming poems, A Scrawl Place, have some bits of humor in them too. Totally. And, tied back to memories and travels in my life. So, yeah. Um, Again, I think me being a more humorous writer, I was more, or a writer who likes abstract writing and things that are odd. You could say Oddball Magazine, right, was the place to publish one of my first ever spoken word, pieces that I submitted to, a lit mag or journal, right? And yeah, so yeah, I would say, I've submitted to quite a few of humorous places, comedy places. And yeah, so you can totally, submit to places that focus on maybe a subject matter you write around a lot, There are some lit magazine journals out there that highlight, trauma, physical pain, some rather heavier topics in life. It could be, you know, um, chronic pain, or chronic physical, illnesses and things like that, or, those with disabilities, even. There are some lit magazine journals geared towards that as well. So, there's a lit mag journal again out there, I'm sure, on a topic that you write around a lot, or have a lot of experience with yourself personally, or absolutely love, right? I mentioned there used to be a lit mag journal that did nothing but martial art poetry, right? And I think that's awesome. They no longer exist. I think it was Clinch Lit. I could be wrong. But, a lot of different focuses out there that some lit magazine journals do, which is really awesome to see. But yeah, so that's pretty much it. This list is good to have. I think there are probably more out there, right? But not a bunch in terms of ones that published a lot of rhyming work, as Emily, Hartstone stated too. But I will do some more digging for you guys. Maybe again, I've put together some lists tied to, for editors and publishers, but I want to also do some lists for submitters, right? Too. And I personally love lists. Sub Club has a lot of great lists. I didn't see one on rhyming poetry, over on Chill Subs, right, or their search database collection list, or even on Sub Club. I don't know if they have one. It's possible I missed it, but yeah, there are very few places out there I think that really highlight rhymes. And if you want to start a lit mag journal that's nothing but rhymes, totally, that's up to you. But I think, again, look at what a lot of lit mags and journals are have published, right, and ask yourself, is it all in rhyme? Is there any rhyme on their publication? Even look at some of the events that happen annually, right? Pushcart Prize, Best of the Net. Look at those poems, right? Are any of them in rhyme? So I'm not saying there aren't award-winning poems that are in rhyme. There are a lot of really stellar, beautiful classics, poems we know today that have rhymes, very specific patterns in them, right? And are very memorable till today, that we talk about, right? I mentioned The Raven, right? Edgar Allan Poe, tons of other ones. And I would say I'm a fan of Shel Silverstein. Absolutely. I absolutely love the cartoons and the drawings and illustration work. And yeah, peanut butter sandwich. Huge fan of that. I'm sure you guys see the peanut butter slices on some of the podcast sections and elsewhere, right? And that's because a comfort food of mine, was over the years, was baguette slices and smooth creamy peanut butter. I know, right? So that's where that sort of came from. I think we all have maybe an energy snack or something that we go to, or our go-to snacks. That was one of mine, I think, over the years. It's not something I eat like regularly before writing poetry or doing anything like that at all, but it's just something I was constantly, just the other day, it was like baguette and peanut butter. It was like, so I totally did a podcast episode on Hummingbird Blink on peanut butter poetry, if I recall, or peanut butter in general. So yeah, some LOL things. And yeah, so I've done a lot of fun rhymes over the years. A lot of my collections do have rhymes, especially some of the ones in the past couple of years. But I'm not a huge rhymester anymore. I think, again, it really happened because of the shock I was going through and the physical trauma. It was, again, by far truly the most painful experience ever in my life, especially in 2020 and 2021. I was, hurting quite a bit, and till today, I still have a lot of, things I go through physically. And it's been absolutely hard for me to also find work, and so I do what I can, other projects, for artists and things like that, some design work on the side. And yeah, and run a lit mag journal press, and I'm trying to restructure things a little bit going forward. But yeah, I've absolutely done my best I can, despite all of the bizarre things that happened to me physically, and, things that could have been prevented, so, in life we're faced with, some unexpected events, a lot of my personal work, I would say, again, uh, really, a lot of my personal work ties back to, that some very rare scary events happen to people. Sometimes something that sounds impossible actually happened to someone. Like, there's a percentage of people, or you could say patients, where they're faced with some very, very bizarre things. They survived. And despite that, right, or people who are not believed, to the point where they're not thoroughly checked, and then it leads to more physical damage to their bodies, right? Or again, maybe meds are pushed on them, and with before a deep dive scan, and then it's a domino effect from there, right? And it's absolutely, again, very dangerous, and it can hurt a lot of human beings, right? It uproots their career, their life. There's a lot of things that happen because people are not believed or gaslighted, even when it comes to emergencies, or feeling something deep down is wrong, like a gut feeling. And a lot of times young people, or people of all ages, trust medical professionals, like, yeah, everything's normal, you're going to be okay. But in reality, if you had that gut feeling and you were right, right, and no one listened to you, no one believed you, and a lot of really very painful things happened to you physically, right? I personally was called all kinds of names, over the years, which was rather painful and heartbreaking. Again, rather disgusting names. Very, very tragic name calling, which, you know, absolutely didn't deserve. Because, from the bottom of my heart, I was telling the truth. And then, years later, right, things show up, and it's like, yeah, obviously, right, because you were telling the truth about what happened. So it's rather painful, right? So a lot of my work, it like covers that, things people had said to me at the time that were, again, rather rude comments, rather nasty, and very painful, even my fam and with medical professionals. And it was rather uncalled for and rather hurtful. So, I think that's the beauty of poetry. Again, we can communicate, things we've gone through. We can raise awareness on things that impact not just us but other fellow human beings, and to really highlight that. Obviously, in some of my collections, I totally was just venting. I think, when we're in pain and we just try to get everything out, right? I think absolutely in 2020, 2021, I had what I would call, sorry to be graphic here, but a lot of word vomit, right? So I would just keep writing, writing, and writing and do a lot of rhyme and rhyme and rhyme and rhyme. But eventually I got out of that rhyme phase and really took the time to, carefully read lit magazine journals to, really, do that, and to I eventually stopped. And I think it happened when I got my first, acceptance that didn't rhyme. And then I sort of continued that, cycle of that, and you have to get in that mindset. I think if you're a rhymester or someone who rhymes currently, it's totally okay, right? There's nothing that says, again, you can't rhyme. It's not a crime to rhyme, at all. But keep in mind that a lot of lit magazine journalists have very specific things they're looking for, maybe themed calls, and they want to maybe do a cohesive anthology or issue of some kind, and yeah, again, some I'll show you some examples outside of this. Maybe one I came across of this, right, where editors outright say they're not fans of rhyming poetry. And yeah, rhyming poetry isn't for everyone, right? Just like poetry isn't everyone's cup of tea. Again, I've seen some people feel that maybe perhaps rhyming is more, they think of it more so geared toward maybe a younger audience would enjoy that, or they feel too generic, or something they maybe seen before too many times, a lot of very common rhymes and things like that. And you can totally create a strong rhyme poem. You can create a very, vivid, detailed poem that introduces rhyme or some sort of pattern. But I think if you're, again, a rhymester, you should challenge yourself to branch out and do other forms and styles of poetry, and challenge yourself to not rhyme at some point in time. I just did a rhyme there totally. But yeah, um, some lit magazine journals, again, totally will be more receptive or open to poetry that rhymes or is more, lyrical in sense, or certain styles, right? Again, there's totally some lit magazine journals that do nothing but haiku or Japanese styled poetry, right? They exactly tell you what they're looking for, right? That's pretty obvious. But some places say they're, right, open to all forms and styles. But I think in most cases, a lot of lit magazine journals don't want to see rhyme poetry or poetry that rhymes. It's not, I'm not saying rhyme poetry is not popular today. Look at a lot of singer songwriters or musicians. Even just the other day, I was listening to a song and I was like, oh, these lines rhyme in the song. I was like, that's awesome. And it was a recent, fairly recent song. So, I think a lot of, people love rhymes. I think it's fun. We can sing them, even they're memorable to us. We can rap them out even, maybe, and, the whole part of the Jazzy Hummingbird project was a series I did, that I wasn't really taking myself seriously a bunch or do anything like that. It was just like, I really just wanted to do various themed collections. A comment I had, I remember on one of the first ever collections I put together, which was originally called Rattled Souls, which I took down and reverted into Extinct, which I unarchived now. It's available. Most of that is also in Chirp on Wood, some of it. Some of my work from high school that I shared out in a self published collection, right? And yeah, so it's really a pretty much lighthearted, digital series from me, and I put a lot of this in various print collections too, which I'm working on redistributing in print again, because they were pulled out of a network, right? But yeah, they're available as ebooks. If you're interested, check it out. You know, uh, I unarchived again some of my earlier work too. Yeah, so I personally, do I, you're probably wondering, do I still rhyme till today? Yeah, from time to time, totally, I do. I'm a fan of riddle poetry. I grew up reading a lot of riddle books, joke books, and fun fact books. That's just who I am. But in terms of when I'm, let's say once in a blue moon, when I'm not working on Dippy Lit Mag, Dirty Press, or other things like the series, right? I do try, submitting to lit mags and journals because I like challenging myself. Some of the prompts and contests are very fun to enter and stuff like that. But no, I haven't been published in like 50, 60, or hundreds of places, and that's okay. The whole importance of it is to keep trying and to do your best, right? And yeah, so I wouldn't say the Jazzy Hummingbird Project series is truly reflective of my writing capabilities or to the fullest extent, even some of my other collections, because just of how much physical things I was going on, around, intracranial pressure, things that make it really hard for you to focus and think and to write through that. It's really tough. So I did the absolute best I could, and writing, the digital design, digital collage art I've done, it really helped me, take my mind off of some rather, dark events happening at the time, on top of, right, the pandemic and other stuff at the time, back then. And yeah, so I, absolutely, it's fun, to be playful in your work. And I think you can do that with rhymes and to let go, if you've never written a rhyme, totally try it, for fun. I've seen some poets in the community say I didn't intentionally mean to rhyme, but I read back this poem that off the top of my head I created, right? And these lines just ended up rhyming together. That happens sometimes. We sometimes don't intend to rhyme, or, I think it's nice to not have forced rhymes. Obviously, we don't want to see that. Forced rhymes make it feel your poem feel disjointed or really disconnected, right? Let's say you have a collection, right? And then one poem out of all of that rhymes, right? That looks really odd, right? And or you have a rhyme in a poem and the rest of it doesn't rhyme, or it feels sort of, sometimes it can feel out of place, right? And things like that. So you want to be very careful. Whatever style of poetry you're doing, or anything like that, you want to ask yourself, why are you doing this? Why are you rhyming, right? Are you rhyming just for the sake of rhyming, or what is it really adding to your poem? You can make a strong rhyme poem, right? But you really have to, I think, consider, right, your vivid details, the focus of it, clarity, the buildup of it, right, the cohesiveness, all of that. There are a lot of factors, right? I think writers, right, maybe tend to look towards rhymes because they want maybe a poem that they feel flows together again as smooth as peanut butter. But that's not necessarily true. Sometimes rhymes can be more of um, for a lot of writers, I think can feel sometimes maybe too generic, or again something they've seen before. Or as that one late night journal, I can't remember the name, but the one earlier I shared, right, mentioned they don't want to see things that are cliche, right? Things that are very obvious, right? You want to have a high amount of originality in your work, right? You don't want to do anything that's been said and done before, right? And yeah, so I think, the collections I've done that are rhyme focused, self-published ones, I, did a lot of, things where I just let go and I didn't really care for what anyone really thinks, Some of my collections, right, totally have gotten 1 star, 4 stars, 5 stars, and I don't really care anymore. But if anyone's taken the time to rate or review any of my, collections of work, I truly appreciate it. It means a lot. It helps, to get feedback on your work and stuff, to see what others think about it. Absolutely. I wouldn't say the Jazzy Hummingbird project is garbage or anything like that. No, I did take the time to really create some meaningful and fun, lighthearted, sometimes LOL collections. But mainly I did that a lot of rhyme because I was, easing back into poetry, and also going through a lot of trauma and shock. So I think for some could say, poetry in a sense is therapeutic or, beneficial. Some say that writing is healing, art is healing. Um, or helps us take our mind off of things, like podcasting helped me too, and doing, various series and projects, right? I think if you stay idle and you're in pain, it just adds, it's really hard to, do that. You have to do things to take your mind off of, traumatic events or things that maybe don't make sense, or unexpected things in your life that, sort of affect you physically, right? And every part of your life, right? It changes, right, when things like that happen. So yeah, I tried to have some, absolutely, I think, positive messages in that series, some fun with it, just be playful with my, word choices and end rhymes, all kinds of rhymes, and I did some haikus, and I broke some rules maybe too, but yeah, so um yeah, so totally, I don't like, focusing on my work or putting links to it a bunch of places or anything like that for the series. If you want to check it out, by all means, you're totally welcome to. I just wanted to talk about rhymes because I have a lot of collections out there that are rhyme focused, and I wanted to share the backstory of what led up to that, because I think, why others rhyme, they have maybe different reasons why they did that for maybe a collection or series. Growing up, I did see a lot of collections that were, tied to, children's stories, right? Or kids' books or fictional characters, right? That had a lot of rhymes in them, and, those illustrated picture books and stuff, I think we've all seen them, growing up and things like that. But uh, don't feel that, oh, rhyming is just for kids, or anything like that. Don't get in that mindset. Across history, right? Poets of, all ages, right, have rhymed at some point in time, right? Poets.org shares some examples of, rhyme poems, and there's tons of other ones out there. I named some earlier in the podcast, right? So, it's not for, rhyming's not for kids or children. You can rhyme as an adult, or you can rhyme as a singer songwriter. It's sometimes, I think a lot of the songs. Think about the songs. Sometimes songs turn to poems, poems turn into songs, right? Totally. Lyrical poetry is a lot of fun, I think. And things like that, but if you think about some of the songs, your favorite songs, they're really catchy, right? Some of them totally have a lot of rhyming in them, or, I think that's awesome. But yeah, I think some people perceive those who rhyme as, or rhymes in general, as being a weak style of poetry, or not very powerful. And that's not necessarily true. You can absolutely make a really solid rhyme poetry that's strong, from end to end. I wouldn't say particularly my, Jazzy Hummingbird product series are the strongest poems I've ever written in my life, or something like that. Again, I wouldn't say it's truly reflective of, like, my writing. I would say, over the years I've written short stories and things like that, and various YA books, right? I have a lot of previews out there of YA series, and some shorter works, things I haven't released the full chapters of till today. One being just sharing additional bonus audio diary here of this episode. But yeah. So again, you can see extinct there, and Viridian Veins. That's an example. Viridian Veins is not poetry. It's a YA series I was working on, right? That's the preview of it, or the chapter initial starting. And I have a couple others, the Eight Chronicles, under my real name, and um also a couple other things I've written, like screenplays, tied back to high school and stuff, that I shared out there, just for fun. When the Time Goes, I think, was one of my first ever short stories that I was really proud of, which was, it spawned from, again, high school, right? Back when I was, through, Fergus Falls High School, IQ Academy, right? We had a lot of really cool writing products that I really loved, and assignments, poetry and everything like that. So that spawned from that. And I really took the time to, go from there, and to self-publish some work that was inspired by a lot of the work I did in high school, and stuff like that. Yeah, you may see I have some interesting cover art. So I try to do some digital collages, or sometimes I incorporate photography too. So that extinct cover on my screen you see is from a trip either from Nevada or Arizona. I can't remember. I think it was Nevada, and it was like the railing, and I flipped it, on its side, the photo, and then edited it, and that I took. Viridian Veins, actually, that cover has changed a couple of times, but that was the first initial cover, one of the first covers I ever did of it, or one of the iterations. The background of this cover, Viridian Veins, here on my screen. So that's just a preview of it. Again, I think that was in 2013. Again, I started working, when I was 19, in 2014. Yeah, I self-published a couple of things in poetry and short stories and YA, stories I was working on, right? And yeah, so that back cover image is actually of Arizona. That is a bit covered up, the mountain or hill. I have the full photo still. And then I overlaid a sky. It sort of looks like a face in the top, but I overlaid a sky of Minneapolis, like a photograph I took. Then edited the color tone of it, and those are actually my hands on the cover. If you back when I didn't have issues with my left hand and side now, but that's actually I isolated a photograph of my hands and did that, for the cover. So yeah, the other ones, those aren't my hands at all, or anything like that. But I do digital collages and stuff like that. The when the time goes, that is actually the background photo is the dock, a wood dock, from a fishing trip with my folks, and then I changed the coloration of that photo. It took me a couple overlays and got it to a point where it was like aged wood, and or almost it looks like moldy wood, but not really, like green wood. So yeah, yeah, that's probably one. I had I'm not sure what happens to some reviews, but I had a couple other reviews on that short story, and yeah, I think it's probably one of my favorite short stories. It's a time traveler, story. I'm a huge fan of the Time Machine, movie with Guy Pearce, and several other time travel movies. I love time travel, stories. Absolutely, I would say. But something I will say, just pointing this out, right? So when I had started Dippy Lit Mag, at some point in time with one of our windows, right, I had, updated our website, and I had put in my bio, right, some of the, Rhymesy collections or the Jazzy Hummingbird Project or something like that in the, Masthead staff section of the site, right? And I noticed after doing that shortly after, we had a high amount of submissions that were very rhymesy, right? Rhyming, or, I could totally tell they were drawing from some things that I had written because it was very specific, right? And we don't, if you look again at Dippy Lit Mag, we don't, heavily publish rhyme poetry or anything like that. Not to say, if you write rhymes, we're gonna decline it or anything like that, but it has to be a strong rhyme poem, like it has to be, powerful, right? Still, if you're gonna rhyme, right? But it shouldn't feel forced or anything like that. So yeah, I personally, yeah, do I like rhyme poetry? Yeah, I would say I don't, I'm not someone who finds rhyming annoying. I'm not someone who doesn't like rhyme, but it's not something that Dipty focuses on. We're not a literary magazine or press that focuses on rhyme poetry. But yeah, if there's a beautiful poem that rhymes, it's strong, very creative, and distinct, sure, that would probably lead to an acceptance. But we don't have every single poem in our series or anything like that, or heavily published. We don't heavily publish rhyme poetry either, like a lot of lit magazine journals out there. But there are totally some lit magazine journals, maybe even presses out there that have published a significant amount of rhyme poetry, are not opposed to that, right? And again, rhyme poetry, right, it shouldn't be frowned upon at all. And it's not something you should shy away from. If you want to rhyme, totally go for it, but take consideration again what the publication is looking for. Read some of the issues and things like that. If you don't see rhyme anywhere in their publication at all, one bit, right, that's probably indicative again that they're not looking for that. some places outright tell you, or editors outright tell you, right, what they don't like and do like, right? And I'll again maybe show you examples in the next episode, of something I just came across, and ironically I was doing an episode around this in the process. So yeah, I would say I love writing riddles and things that rhyme in terms of riddle poetry. I'm a fan of, and from time to time, yes, I do write rhymes, but in the sense of approaching lit mags and journals today, I do not heavily rhyme, and yeah, anymore. I wouldn't say I'm a rhymester anymore. I would say, yeah, from occasionally I do some rhymes, for sure. But yeah, don't feel like, oh, I'm a rhymester. Lit mags and journals and presses aren't going to want to publish my work. um, you know, uh, I would say, if you're a rhymester, really push yourself to, again, challenge yourself to do other styles and forms of poetry. But know that, if you rhyme and you have poems absolutely that you love that do rhyme, you can still, if you're not able to find a home for it, let's say even the lit magazine journals out there that outright, state they are open to rhymes, or, in taking rhyme, submissions, decline you too, you can always self-publish that, right? I've done collections that have nothing but rejected rhymes in them, literally, and just dumped a bunch of rando rejected rhymes together, in a collection, because I thought those poems were pretty fun, and I'm just like, yeah, I'm still gonna put those out there, and yeah, there is not for everyone, and that's okay. So, anyways, I just wanted to cover rhymes a bit because I think it does come up, today, the whole aspect of whether or not you should rhyme, and yeah, for the most part, yeah, I agree with Emily here, right? There really aren't a lot of journals and lit mags that, really zero in on rhyming and have a welcome sign to all rhymes and stuff like that, or rhyme poetry. But that doesn't mean you can't rhyme or shouldn't, if you really want to, especially in your, personal work. If lit mags and journals aren't accepting your rhymes or your particular style of poetry that you specialize in or really love, or a certain style or format, right? You can, again, do your own work, and what I did, right? I self-published. I did that because I couldn't find a home for all of those rejected rhymes. I had tried, in the early years when I started submitting to places and easing back in, right? I did a lot of rhymes. I tried submitting rhymes, and they were heavily declined for sure. And I just ended up self-publishing a lot of rhymes, and yeah, outside of the Jazzy Hummingbird project, and some of them did make it in the project too, a lot of my rejected rhymes, but yeah, some poets totally did enjoy these, and maybe not everyone will like it. Maybe some people will be like, oh, these poems are really silly, and some of them, I outright say some of these are really silly, goofy poems and collections, and that's the whole purpose of it, to have fun and let go. I dedicated a collection to, my dog, and he passed away, Toby. I def miss him, and yeah. So if you want to do a rhyme collection, there's rhyme collections I've seen tied to cats. Even, if you want to do that, dedicated to your pet or cat or dog, yeah. So you can really have fun with writing. I think that's what's really nice about being an artist or writer, or expressing yourself. Really, if someone says they hate rhyme poetry, right, you can't force anyone to like it, or poetry in general. I personally don't heavily share my writing with my fam. Sure, I've shared issues of Dipty in the chapbooks and publications through Dipty Lit Mag and Press, but the poems I've written about things tied back to fam and others, I don't, because I think um not everyone's going to receive it the same way. Some perhaps are, I think in my fam personally, some are very sensitive to things like that. Like, it's okay for them to joke about others and things like that, but when you make a joke about them, they may take it the wrong way, if you're writing a poem about someone, right? So yeah, and stirring up things of the past, right? Some people don't like to share those things out, or things of that nature, some dark moments maybe in your life or your family tree, right? So yeah, some are absolutely supportive, of maybe fam friends you have, of your writing, your work, and things like that. Or, maybe they absolutely hate poetry or anything tied to that. Maybe they really hate rhymes, but yeah, so I don't, rhyme all the time, or anything like that. But I have a lot of collections out there totally that are nothing but rhyme. Absolutely. Yeah. When I, went into, shock and, from physical trauma, I was really just trying to write as much as possible, and I think it did help to just do rhymes. I think writing the first things that came to my head, or just letting go and getting really silly and goofy. I was going through a lot of things at the time, and you could say I was like felt I was in the twilight zone, right? Like everything was going wrong. Quite a bit, back to back. And this project, the series I did, other collections really helped me just express myself, to alleviate, the things I was going through, like physical pain and things like that. And I think we all have something, we go to when we undergo a severe amount of, physical pain, or some rather, bad, sad, not so rad events. I think I said that on the Hummingbird Blink podcast quite a bit. But yeah, so even in the descriptions of all these collections, I did rhyme quite a bit, so they're for the most part rather humorous. The Jazzy Hummingbird Project, I would say things outside of this series I did, it's not as humorous. Not all, but some are. So it's like 50-50, some of my work out there, and yeah. So I have quite a bit of this in print too, but I'm working on changing the distribution of it a little bit. So yeah, if you want to check out some of my work, totally, and yeah, if you look again at some of the work I've had, in terms of poetry acceptances, now and then, it's, again, a majority of it's not in rhyme at all. So, yeah, I think that says something about, what lit magazine journals are looking for. Most of them, don't publish rhyme, so I know I've on a couple lit magazine journals I've featured on this podcast, or spotlighted. I did end up submitting way back years ago some rhymes to some of the ones I discussed in this podcast, and they ended up in declines, by the way. So yeah, yeah. So I'm not sure again on Pulse Beat Poetry Journal, the lyric magazine, on some of these if they're open right now at all. But yeah, it's pretty interesting. Again, the focuses of these, right? So I think this one, it says, was founded in 1921. The Lyric is the oldest magazine in North America devoted to traditional public poetry. So yeah, yeah. So I think you really have to read through the issue and see if they have anything, like that, maybe pick up issues. So yeah, this is an example, right? Right here on the Lyric magazine, in selected poems, right? You can see there are, some rhymes here, right off the bat. I see some rhyming here on Jonathan Kinsman's poem, The Poet Constellates, right? So we have some end rhymes here, tonight, light, right? Just an example. And yeah, so that is indicative of, I don't know if they're open right now, but yeah, this is summer 2025, so it looks like they are still active, the Lyric magazine. So I think that's interesting. So yeah, it's just an example, right? There are lit mags and journals out there that do feature and publish rhymes, but again, something that I talked about earlier. I know this is a super long episode, but I want to cover this because I think it is rather important. Taking consideration the styles of poetry you're submitting to lit magazine journals, and really looking through issues and examples that they have, of what they're looking for, and reading the guidelines carefully. I would also say, read the staff bios, and sometimes there's notes there on things they like, or even what I think I like seeing some lit magazine journals do. We don't do this currently, but they outright state some poets they're a fan of, from the past and present, or that they love to, or totally. I've seen a list of poets that they are fans of, mentioned, or work samples to good examples to read, if you're going to submit to them in advance, which I think is really beneficial. But yeah, again, this is I've never been on their page before, the Lyric magazine at all. So I think, not that I can recall. So this is cool, again, you discover, lit magazine journals. This one's been around for quite some time. So I've heard of them, I think, but I've never been on their site maybe or anything like that. But again, some lit magazine journals have been around a very, very long time. And yeah, so I think that's very cool. Again, so yeah, I'm familiar that the Lothlorien Journal, they took two of my rhyme poems, so they didn't decline those. And I'm not sure about Sublunary Review, or it looks like they were active last year, right? And I don't know about some of these places, if they're open currently or not. But yeah, you can see, yeah, Blue Unicorn has published some 2025 volumes here. And yeah, I think Pearl Poetry and Prose is closed again. And for I don't know if they're coming back. It says no longer accepting submissions at Pearl Poetry and Prose, right? Um, yeah. And yeah, so yeah, it looks like they were around for 15 years. And yeah. So yeah, so I think they're no longer active, I think, is what I'm reading here. Um, they said issue 35 at Pro was their swan song, right? So issue 36 was no longer forthcoming, and yeah. So yeah. Um, but yeah, the other ones, I think, most on that list are active, not all though, from what I can tell. And if you go to Pulse Beat issues, yeah, September 2025 here, right? So Pulse Beat Poetry Journal is active. And I'm not sure if all these have chill subs listings or, not. But yeah, Westward Quarterly. I'm not sure if they're open. We can check here. Let's see. Back issues. So it looks like the last issue that went out was oh yeah, so they have a fall 2025 issue available. So Westward Quarterly looks like it's active. Yeah. So I think just Pearl Poetry and Prose, and the other one on the list, right? Spark and Stone is not active anymore. And the others look like they are. Innisfree, INNIS free. Um let's see if they are currently publishing, or the last archive they have. So it looks like fall 2024 they've had publications. I don't know. Some of these you could, of course, as I've showed you on this podcast, you know how to check Duotrope, Chill Subs, and elsewhere to see if a place is active or not. If you do a search, Chill Subs and the name of the Lit Mag Journal, you can usually find their page still, and sometimes it'll show up as defunct or active, right? And again, highly recommend you create a Chill Subs profile or account. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah, so it's possible Innisfree Poetry could be, active. Yeah. So yeah, I think they have certain windows, right? For spring and fall, right? So I don't see anything about closure here on Innisfree Poetry, or that they're not active. So that might be one to check out, if you're interested. Blue Unicorn's active. So just Pro Poetry and Prose is not, and Spark and Stone. So yeah, I'm not familiar with all of these, but I've heard of some of the ones here totally. Yeah, I think again the Lyric magazine looks very cool. They've been around for quite some time. Yeah. So that's pretty much it. I will link below this author published article. Totally check out authors published. I think this is a good write up by Emily Hartstone. I'm sure there are other lit magazine journals out there. I might do some digging my own and make some lists for you guys on the Substack for this. I've put out, just sharing some updates, right? So I put out some articles recently tied to, nomination events, for, publishers or editors to be aware of, like a list together. Also, some accompanying list of some episodes in the past, like distribution platforms or server distributors, for books and, magazines and publishers, right? And also I have done, how to find jobs at various publishing houses or lit magazine journals, and also how to look for submission calls, right? Various, just a list of sites, which I covered on the podcast and plugged in descriptions too. But I tend to update descriptions of any new things I come across too. So do look back at those, especially the earlier Q and A's. And yeah, so I've put together a couple company lists for, submitters and also founding editors and publishers that may totally be beneficial. I know not everyone likes listening to audio again, so I have some accompanying text and lists to these episodes. I will definitely be looking into, some more lit magazine journals maybe that are, maybe open to rhyming poetry more so than others. I'm sure there are more than 8 out there. There are thousands upon, right, lit mags and journals in existence all over the world. So I'm probably sure there's probably more than this, but this is a good list to have. Authors Published does a good job, sharing, list to alongside also Chill Subs does a great job. The Sub Club, their whole team. I didn't find a rhyme list from Sub Club or Chill Subs at all, but it's possible I missed it or something. Um, yeah. So, just again, it's a good idea to read issues carefully, to browse and see what a lit mag journal is looking for. I just showed you earlier, right? Yeah, they were totally on some of those lit magazine journals I was on, right? That you could see that they had, poems that had rhymes in them, right? So yeah, that's a green light or a light bulb. Yeah, they are open to seeing rhyme, right? And publishing that more so than others. Yeah. But overall, in terms of the question of the day, right? So again, yes, you can rhyme, but most places out there to today, currently, they don't typically publish rhyme poetry a bunch. There are very, very, very few places out there that do so. And yeah, um, and if you want to rhyme in your work or do rhymes, yeah, it's okay. It's okay to create some fun poems or rather serious poems even with rhymes. Again, a lot of poets throughout history and writers have rhymed at least once in their life, I'm sure. And sometimes when you're just speaking, you rhyme accidentally. It happens to all of us. We can still create a lot of really meaningful, lovely poems with rhymes, incorporated or very specific patterns. Again, you can, elevate your work, right? When you're writing, and there's a lot of things you have to take into consideration, in construction of a poem. I won't go into that because it'll be a very rather long episode, right? But maybe I can do articles around, things to take into consideration when creating a poem, or I did an article, right? Typical reasons why, others face declines and rejections, right? A lot of other writers in the community and, founding editors or, have totally written articles like that too, on what's the typical reason, submitters or writers, poets, artists get declines, right? And I've covered that on the podcast too a little bit. But yeah, anyways, check out those articles I've been doing out on Substack, and they may be beneficial to you. And yeah, I hope this episode helped you, talking about rhymes. I know it was really, really long, but yeah, I wanted to share again the backstory of what led up to me being, maybe perceived as a rhymester, for quite some time. But in reality, I'm not much of a rhymester anymore or anything like that. But I do like to do some rhymes and have fun. Totally, absolutely. And a lot of my personal work I do, yeah, I've done some rhymes tied to, healthcare, medical care, and things like that, patient experiences, and all kinds of things like that. I've done vampire rhymes, I've done mummy haikus and stuff, so I have collections out there like that. I've done pigeon poetry, pigeon poetry. So yeah. So you can really let go and have fun in your work. The Jazzy Hummingbird project was mostly rather goofy and silly and fun. And yeah, I was going through again a bunch of physical trauma and back to back physical events, that my folks weren't aware of. And again, some rather, unfortunate things happened, right? Wrong calls, mistakes on top of that, and it led to, damage, right? Totally. And yeah, so I've done the best I can, with running Dippity Lit Mag and Press thus far, and doing, as much as possible, sharing in the series, and you know um the publications I've done thus far. And yeah, so I would say, considering everything that happened, perhaps in others' eyes, Dippy Lit Mag, Dirty Press isn't successful, but I think I did accomplish quite a bit, personally, considering everything I went through physically was truly, again, very, very, very painful. And, yeah, I never really expected to do, a bunch of rhyme collections or anything like that myself, but I really, you know, um, just tried to have fun and let go. I told myself, when I was starting this, right, I never really took the time to really let go and be silly in my writing a bunch, as much as I wanted to, prior to 2020. And I was like, yeah, I'm just going to go for it, and just see what happens. And I ended up doing a bunch of different themed rhyme collections, So that's what this series is. It's just me letting go, having fun, and they're not necessarily all about me. Again, sometimes they're observational. I like to create characters or, stories with, the poems I do sometimes, and, some fun things like that, and some characters and focal points. So yeah, it's a lot of these are very, very short, rather short collections in the series. And I have, other, publications I've done, right, that are, yeah, a bit longer in length, and, tied to my experiences with, you could say, medical care. And sometimes I have some pretty random collections, where I dump a bunch of poems in it, like rejected rhymes and other things, right? Yeah, so I haven't, sold thousands of books or anything like that by any means. No, and I didn't really go into writing the series with the intention of trying to become a bestseller or anything like that. No, I was just really, really trying to take my mind off of physical pain and things I went through that were rather traumatic, which I discuss in some of my collections. And I have another work that I've been working on too, that goes into a little bit more detail, because I think poetry is rather abstract sometimes, and not as clear as like a memoir would be, or something of that nature, right? That really outright states what you went through and faced, right? The challenges and obstacles and you went through physically, and the events exactly. Yeah. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I just wanted to take the time to share that. Some parts of this podcast is an audio diary series, sharing my experiences as a writer and artist, and things I've encountered, right? So yeah, I've definitely had my fair share of rejections, hundreds upon hundreds till the day. I get rejections, too, once in a blue moon when I try. Again, I haven't been widely published or anything like that. I've done a lot of self publications, more so, I would say. And I think it's really hard, as, also a lot of founding editors, to find time for their personal products and work, and things like that. So you have to have that. It's hard to find that balance. Some founding editors are also, have families, or maybe doing college courses on top of that, or maybe dealing with, physical things too, a lot of obstacles. So it's tough, to find time for that. But yeah, I think that's why it's nice to have a, volunteer staff, again, when you need to take breaks and things like that. They can maybe help fill the gaps you have, and the times you need to step away, right? So yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah, I wanted to cover my experiences with rhymes and talk about, that, yeah, it's okay to rhyme. And but it's hard to find, I think, a home for rhyming poetry. Absolutely. If you really, really love rhymes. And yeah, there aren't a bunch of places out there, to my knowledge. But there could be, again, some younger audience, lit magazine journals out there geared towards younger audiences, maybe, or or even humor lit magazine journals that maybe have published rhymes in the past, that I've come across. I just can't think of the names off the top of my head. Besides Lothlorien, Poetry Journal, and Better Than Starbucks are literary journals that I know for a fact I've seen, mentioned in lists in the past that were open to rhyming poetry, and a few others, but I'm really sorry I can't remember them outside of this list that Emily Hartstone has, which is awesome. I think it was hard to find these because it is hard, to find places that are open to rhymes, today, nowadays, yeah, in the lit mag world. So yeah, if you want to in the comments, totally let me know. Yeah, do you rhyme? Do you like reading rhyming poetry, or do you not enjoy it? Do you find rhyming poetry annoying, or what are your thoughts around rhyming poetry? I'm just curious. If you're listening to this podcast, wherever you may be, drop a comment. You don't have to, but yeah, just a question for you, I guess. I personally do love riddle poetry and riddles. I tend to rhyme in my riddles and stuff, and occasionally, and things like that. But nowadays, approaching, lit magazine journal presses again, when I do that or challenge myself, even prompts and challenges online in terms of writing, I do not rhyme, 9 times out of 10, yeah, in a lot of my personal collections, sure. Yeah, I let go, have fun with it. It doesn't really matter, right? But lit magazine journals and publications are really looking for rather specific things, sometimes themes and their guidelines, right? Or again, they may state it. Scan a website very carefully, right? And you will, and read through issues. You'll get a feel of what the lit magazine journal is looking for. I think it is important to do that. But yeah, even if you do that, follow the guidelines and write poems that don't rhyme, right? That doesn't automatically mean, of course, you'll get an acceptance. You have to create. It's hard, challenging, right, to create, a poem that a lit magazine journal is looking for. We've all had, founding editors, right, even have had their fair share of rejections, a bunch, till today. So yeah, that's pretty much it. That's the episode on rhyming. Yeah. So yeah, hopefully this helped you, me talking about my thoughts on rhyme and my personal experiences, and I just wanted to share that. So yeah. Anyways, yeah, so take care, guys, and in the next episode it'll probably be either a Q&A episode or a spotlight episode. I was leaning towards doing a spotlight episode, so we'll see. It may be a mixture, or we'll see what happens. And yeah, again, I would really encourage you to lean in on your personal experiences and write from your heart, of course. Yeah, sure. You can, if you're a fiction writer, totally, there are so many writes you could do and still inspired by, things around you, or things you've gone through, but, you create characters, fictional, things around it, stories. And yeah, so there's so much you can do with writing, but I think in nearly all the poems, 98% of them that I've had accepted were all very rather specific to things I actually went through, or experiences, or people in my life. And majority of them do not rhyme. So I think that goes to show you, yeah, again, yeah, rhyme isn't heavily published at a lot of lit magazine journals and that I've seen to date. But yeah, if you look outside of lit mags and journals, the lit mag world, yeah, a lot of artists, again, singers, songwriters, others out there, even maybe authors that do heavily do rhymes, or maybe illustrative work alongside of rhymes. Even I've seen that till today. Rhymes are still widely used. It's not, again, something that should be looked down upon. I think, again, a lot of people perceive rhymes as being, automatically a poem that's going to suck. Maybe people think that, and that's not necessarily true. It really comes down to, your word choices, the form, the structure, your, everything, tying together. So yeah, just because a poem rhymes doesn't mean it's going to be a bad poem. It doesn't mean it's going to be weak or automatically something that sucks or anything like that. It's not a bad thing to rhyme, but I think, again, really, really challenge yourself to do more than just rhymes. I think it's important to branch out in other styles and to challenge yourself. and to, see what you can do, outside of rhyming, and if you love rhyming, that's great, but I think really branch out and do that. If you really intend on, getting work placed in lit magazine journals or presses even, and, chapbooks and stuff like that, really extend yourself beyond rhymes, really, don't get in that mindset again that poems, have to rhyme. Poems don't have to rhyme, okay? They don't have to. You can have a really smooth as peanut butter poem without rhymes too, in terms of flow, structure, and the clarity, back to back, and yeah. Just like with stories, right? Oftentimes a lot of, people say, yeah, stories should have a build up, right? Poems can have a build up too, and you don't have to rhyme to get to that point. You don't have to rhyme to have something that flows, very cleanly, right? And yeah, you can really be, I think with poems, you can really let go, right? It's not like technical writing or anything like that. It's not like technical documentation. You can really be experimental and let go, right? And that's what I tried to do with a lot of my rhymester collections. Yeah, for sure. But it wasn't like super abstract or anything like that. I did some, to be honest, I did some rather straightforward rhymes across that collection. And yeah, and a lot of them were very themed, I think, heavily, because a comment I had in one of the first collections I ever had was like, self-published, was like, oh, nothing fits together, it's not focused around anything, it's pretty random. I have a lot of random collections, yeah, that's true. So with the Jazzy Hummingbird project I posted and since, I'm going to do a bunch of, cohesive, predominantly cohesive themed collections, right? Tying the poems are tying together, interconnected, the series, right? It's connected in the sense that it's predominantly rhyme, but they focus on different topics and different things for different themes and focuses, right? So it's not necessarily you have to read it in a certain order. That series, the Jazzing Hummingbird Project, if you do, you could read it out of order. It's just lined up that way, So I have a lot of, rather short micros and LOL things, and just a lot of humor and comedy for the most part, and some sad ones, but some, things that are, situational, right? Putting myself in other shoes or from things I've observed throughout life. It's not about me per se, that collection or the series, I should say, but it does draw from things that mattered to me in life, like the importance of, communication, losing contact with others, and, you know, um, just, yeah, it ties back to some key elements of life, I'd say, but not all of it. Some of it's really goofy for sure. Yeah, especially the ones on pigeons and the a few other ones totally. And I think I even have one on cockroaches and some LOL things, for sure. But yeah, it's okay, to do, projects like this or series if you want to, so, where you let go and, you may do a personal project of some kind and others may give it a 1 star or an F plus, and as long as you love it, that's all that really matters. It's not necessarily, maybe that what you worked on got you through a rather painful, dark time. Maybe it helped you, I think it helps to write and get things off, your mind, your chest, right? You can really, feel like bricks are taken off your shoulder. In the sense of what I was going through physically, maybe, it was rather hard to get away from that feeling of like, earth crushing pressure, but it did, take my mind off of the things I was going through quite a bit, I think when you just sit around and do nothing, right, you're just in constant pain, right? It's good to keep your mind active when you go through like physical painful events, right? And to do things. So yeah, some people say, those who write poetry or, literary arts or things like that, I've been told, oh, you do nothing, or don't see any value from it because it doesn't earn a bunch. But, that wasn't what the point of, all this was, sure. Yeah. A lot of writers, a lot of artists would love to, do it full time and to do that, right? Do something they love and to get a salary from it. But, ultimately, a lot of lit mags and journals and presses are, bleeding money, right? They're losing a lot of money year after year or just scraping by. It's very hard to sustain a lit mag journal press that doesn't just break even or doesn't go under or is near going under every year. It's very challenging. So yeah, I've totally done the best I can thus far, considering a lot of truly painful events spawning from 2020 for me. And yeah, so everything I've written, tied to medical nature, healthcare world is 1,000% true again. These other collections I've done, the Jazzy Hummingbird Project, a lot of those things are, for the most part, fictional character rights and perspective rights, but outside of that, I've done absolutely some rather true rights around things I've gone through and rather painful things others have said to me while I was going through rather difficult, confusing, and, rather traumatic events physically. Again, people can call someone all the names they like, right? Or they shouldn't do that, obviously. But I'm saying, no matter how many names someone calls someone, right? I think a lot of women, men, or human beings of all ages, right? The evidence of what they went through, the physical trauma, it always stays with them, right? Some things are permanent and very evident, right? And yeah, it doesn't really matter what anyone says because the evidence is within them of what they went through and all of the challenges and obstacles, right? Physical trauma, right? It changes your world forever. A lot of people. So that's what, some of my work tries to emphasize, right? The severe, results of that, right? Of not being believed and not being listened to, how it creates a chain reaction in your life. It affects, your relationships with others. It affects your career, your day-to-day activities change, your whole, life plans change, right? It's like the rug is pulled from under you. It can feel that time. So I think, again, art and writing ground a lot of human beings who go through, a lot of trauma and physical events. Poetry, I think a lot have said, or things have been done around it where it can feel like, a form of meditation or yoga, as I've said on the Hummingbird Blink, right? It can be relaxing to, do things that are, maybe you love, that are creative in nature, right? So that's pretty much it, guys. This was super long. I'm so sorry, but I wanted to talk about rhymes. I wanted to take some time to share the backstory of some of my, predominantly rhyme collections, out there. And yeah, so that's pretty much it. Again, I'm gonna do some digging on what I can find, in terms of other late magazine journals that emphasize rhyme and maybe a few other focuses. I know everyone loves lists in the community, and I'm hoping to do some really cool interviews too with some of the things I've covered on this podcast thus far. To help founding editors too, and existing and future ones, and then yeah, and then talk more about some platforms and resources or tools, maybe for submitters and publishers, and just sharing my experiences and things I think I've gone through maybe could help others too. And yeah, and then spotlight a couple new lit magazine journals, some other ones, that have been around a while, some fairly new ones, before the end of the year. Don't forget to check out poets.org. They're a great resource, if you want to learn about other forms and styles of poetry, or I think it's important to, see examples and, to be aware of the various terminology in the poetry world too, and yeah. So Poetry Foundation is also awesome, and there are a couple other sites out there. But yeah, definitely one to check out and bookmark. They also have, I shared on an article, right, a job section. There are other places I linked out in a recent article on how to find volunteer reading opportunities, volunteer jobs, part-time, full-time opportunities, hybrid work opportunities in the publication space. So check out that article. And I segmented it out by submitters and editors right on Substack. So hopefully that helps. And yeah, so I'll see you in the next episode. Probably be either a spotlight episode or Q&A. I do occasionally get, some questions and stuff, so I try to plug those in. So not necessarily always what I say I'll cover in the next episode, but just an indicative of what might I cover. Sometimes I change my mind, which is okay, but yeah, I try to stick to what I say I'm going to cover at least, or do articles around it if I don't cover it in an episode. So, yeah. So if you're wondering like where the inspiration came for this series, aside from the name I already mentioned, right? My nickname tied to my actual name, like my folks throughout the years called me, and then the hummingbirds, right? I kept seeing them the past couple years quite a bit by my window. You know, I think, I would say again, a lot of this like comes from things, elements in my life that were reoccurring. You know, I thought about that time I accidentally left the iron too long back in my home state. You know, on the carpet upstairs, and it left this imprint. And I never forgot that. I was like, oh, how did that happen? It like dropped, and I was like so embarrassed by that, and it was really a moment of like OMG for me. So that's what sort of inspired Iron Me to the Moon. And I have, I'm fond of outer space and things like that. So wolves, I've used wolves, I think, quite a bit in a lot of my work, and in digital art elsewhere. So yeah, but that collection's not about wolves or anything like that. It's a mix of different things, a mashed potatoes collection, you could call it. And lychee 2033. So just talking through some titles. This is a bonus bit. I know this episode's super long again. I'm sorry, but yeah, just sharing. So I always loved lychee. I think, my grandpa, one of the trips I had that was quite memorable over to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. My grandpa had brought this plastic bag of lychee, fresh from like freshly picked, and it was so good, guys. And then over the years, obviously, sometimes, back in my home state, Minnesota, right, I would, sometimes, I think one time we did get lychee, or those drinks, those lychee drinks, but they're really high in sugar, so I don't really like the overly sweet ones, but still it was fairly good. But I never forgot the fresh lychee. It's not necessarily about lychee, but some of the titles tie back to very memorable things in my life. So that's what I sort of emphasize sometimes, and ice cold spaghetti whiskey. So that collection ties back to, the title. I've never drank anything in my life or anything like that, or I don't, smoke or drink at all ever in my life. I've never done that. So the collection more so was a perspective, right? Sure, I've sat in bars and stuff and had meals and stuff, but never drink or smoke or anything like that. I absolutely love pasta and spaghetti, so totally. But it was more so, that collection ties to things about life, in general, and things like that. Things maybe people think about. I've done poems around, growing older, life lessons, aging, things like that, right? Galactic Bird Brain. So I would say I was a huge fan of, the whole aspect of, the various. I think it's just cool how many bird species exist in the world. I mentioned on, Hummingbird Blink, that podcast, right? Um, the Big Year. I was a huge fan of that movie, of Jack Black. I just thought it was interesting, that whole competition of identifying bird calls and spotting bird. I think it was a 2011 comedy movie, right? The Big Year. So I love that movie and various, bird movies. I think I've always been fond of fun fact books. Over the years, I had, a lot of aquarium species books. Maybe that's for another episode to talk about my experiences with aquarium fish and stuff over the years, because I've quite a bit, but yeah. So I think I've always paid a lot of attention to birds, like whenever they be outside a window or, back home state, woodpeckers and things like that. And, blue jays and, hummingbirds and eagles. I saw a bald eagle one time, with my dad just sitting on the fence, like out of the blue in Minnesota. I was like, oh my gosh, there's a bald eagle right in front of us. So, I think, and, again, outer space, and I think Galactic Bird Brain spawns from, the title. And then also, there was a place, Galactic Pizza. I used to grab pizza at, aside from Pizza Luce. So, Crunkor Skunk. I don't really know Crunkor. I don't know if you guys know what Crunkor means. I won't spoil it for you guys, but yeah. So I try to learn sometimes new words and do collections around that, too, and yeah, and just some fun ones, themed ones. The hills have chicken curry spills, right? That like couples facing division, or getting into tiffs, stuff like that, just for fun. Burnt toast, is just some LOL stuff. Haikus typically are not, I sort of bent the rules, I think, a little bit on some things when I was writing this in pain, but I did the best I could. And Dr. Mummy Mouth again. So that one was tied to a little bit, my love of, the Mummy movie, right? I don't know how many of you guys are aware. I heard they're in talks to do a new one, right? Which is really cool. I'm a huge fan of, I would say, the Mummy movie. The original 1999 with Brendan Fraser, and yeah, and the second one, and then yeah, I personally really love a lot of movies that take place with that kind of theme. I was a fan of, right, the Kane Chronicles by Rick Riordan, and there was, I think, a horror movie also that I saw quite a few times. 2014, The Pyramid. So adventure movies, and national treasures. So sort of that. Then I have other collections, tied to different things, and memories and stuff, and just some fun things. I was thinking about, in some things I wrote, right, utopia, or the opposite of utopias and stuff. And then, like, if someone has a bad experience at a really cruddy motel and stuff like that. And I was doing collections around video games, chess, even. I grew up going to a lot of chess tournaments. And then a fun, pigeon collections. Not really, some aren't really about pigeons, but yeah, so a little playful. There's a lot of pigeons I see in Nevada, right? And some things tied back to my home state, Minnesota. So yeah, just sharing some things I thought about, in terms of the titling. If you think the titling's pretty LOL, yeah, it comes from some LOL things in my life and some memories, actually. And I think bathroom malls, it's more so, I think, how different things impact us, and there's some lighthearted LOL things, I think, across each collection. Not all of it is poetry. I have, like, one thing I wrote, I think, just for fun, a list of things you could do as a bucket list, and that was just for fun, honestly. It's not necessarily my actual bucket list, but it was just like a rhymesy bucket list. I did fun things like that, um, just, for fun, and it's okay to, let go and just do, things that, are, just not necessarily things you're really looking to have, placed in lit magazine journals, but just things you do outside, personal projects are okay like this, So, yeah, if you specialize in a haikus, or if you specialize in a certain form of poetry or style that you really love, and you want to do, if you can't find a home for some of your work, it's bound to happen, and I think absolutely some poets do, end up self-publishing that, or sharing that elsewhere. It could be on their social media feed. It could be, just like, I've seen a lot of poets do, self publications like I do, right? And I put a bunch in Rejected Rhymes, some other collections outside of this and elsewhere. So, yeah, it's totally up to you. Don't, leave your rejected work sitting. I think, you can totally share that out with others. If you have work that, several years, or has gotten like 50, 60 rejections on it, don't wait to get published, is what I'm saying. You can totally go out and, do a self publication, And yeah, I mentioned on the podcast, right? What to do if your work keeps getting rejected. That's always an option. You don't necessarily need to go through a publisher, but I think it's nice to submit to lit magazine journals, right? I think it's a lot of fun. It's a great learning experience. And yeah, so I covered in one episode, the reasons why you should submit to lit magazine journals again, but there's always again that option of self-publication, right? Which some writers do end up doing, right? And yeah, so that's all.